Listen, they laughed in my face, but what they didn't know was that I was holding the one thing that could burn their whole little empire down. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about what happens when you push the quiet one too far. And she finally decides to show everyone the truth you hoped would stay buried. Don't blink, because the moment I pressed play, their entire world collapsed. My name is Kendra. I'm 34 years old. And this is how I turned their betrayal into my blueprint for power. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. The ballroom glittered like a dream. Crystal chandeliers poured warm light over every polished surface, catching on the gold ribbons that curled around the banisters as if they were holding the whole illusion in place. For a moment, the room felt too bright to hold the truth I carried. It smelled like pine from the towering Christmas tree and champagne from every glass already half emptied. Someone near the dessert table had drenched themselves in vanilla perfume so thick it clung to the air. The caterers had laid out miniature pecan pies and peppermint bark on trays shaped like silver snowflakes. Our office never did anything small, and Tennessee winters always made people want a little more sparkle than they usually allowed themselves. The DJ's voice boomed over the room. His laughter traveled with the bass as if he were standing in the center of every speaker. Time for the Christmas party recap. The crowd responded instantly. A ripple of laughter. Someone whistled. People nudged each other and leaned forward like they were settling in for a harmless highlight reel. And in the front row sat Graham, my boss, with one arm draped in casual ease around Tessa, the woman who attached herself to him the way ivy clings to brick. Her red lipstick flashed each time she laughed too quickly, too brightly, as if the sound could bend the room toward her. They looked smug. They looked untouchable. They looked like people who had forgotten the world had consequences. I stood beside the massive projector screen, holding the remote. It felt small, but solid in my hand, almost like the kind of object you forget you are holding until you realize it could shift the ground beneath an entire room. My fingers trembled for half a heartbeat. I stilled them. I let a small smile settle at the corner of my mouth. Then I pressed play. The first clips were harmless, coworkers dancing out of rhythm, someone dropping a gag gift and pretending it was intentional. The camera caught me passing around a tray of gingerbread cookies while someone shouted Martha Stewart, who from somewhere off screen. The room filled with easy laughter, soft and rolling, exactly what they all expected. Then the screen flickered, a split second of scrambled light, the kind of glitch people usually ignore, but when the image stabilized, it was no longer. Holiday footage. No music, no jokes, no celebratory sparkle. Instead, it showed a grainy security angle from behind the Christmas tree in the east corner of the ballroom. It was a spot we used for overflow storage during events. Most people forgot it existed. In the footage, Graham and Tessa stood tucked into that shadowed corner, not tangled in each other, not kissing, not anything a tabloid would splash across a front page. Instead, they were speaking in low, urgent voices, faces close enough that anyone watching would feel the tension in their posture. And then Graham pulled a slim folder from his coat, the kind usually stamped confidential across the front. The security feed zoomed automatically as if the lens itself knew something important was unfolding. Page after page appeared in his hands. Printed transaction summaries, company accounts. Funds shifted between departments with no authorizing signatures. A list of purchases routed through vendors we had never approved. Tessa pressed her fingers to the pages and traced the amounts. Her smile in the footage was small and satisfied. She pointed to a line item and whispered something that made Graham nod. Then he tugged out a second sheet from the folder and passed it to her. This one was stamped with an internal memo code everyone in finance would recognize. The code only appeared on documents intended for audit review, yet here it was in her hand behind a Christmas tree while the party raged a few feet away. Gasps moved through the ballroom like a wind shift. People leaned forward. Some covered their mouths. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Graham's champagne glass slipped from his fingers and struck the floor with a sharp clink that echoed more like a warning bell than an accident. It did not break. It only rolled a few inches, then settled near the foot of his chair. Tessa's lipstick smile vanished. The color drained from her face as if the screen itself had pulled it away. I said nothing. I did not blink. The footage continued. The two of them comparing sheets. Total amounts circled in pen. Percentages written in margins. A timestamp visible in the corner. It was from last Tuesday. It was not the first meeting. The system saved every clip that crossed certain thresholds, including any time-restricted documents were handled outside approved rooms. The room behind me fell silent except for the soft hum of the projector. No one moved. No one seemed to breathe. I clicked next. The projection switched to emails. Timestamps lined up in cold precision. Messages from Graham approving transfers that bypassed verification. Notes from Tessa confirming receipt. Subject lines marked review later. Draft attachments missing from our version control system. It all appeared in chronological order. Each slide another step into the truth they thought would stay hidden. Then came the expense report. 2 names, 1 hotel, several nights billed as team building. The amounts were small enough to slip past. Many eyes, but the frequency told its own story. This time, the room murmured again. A different sound than before. Less shock, more recognition. People connecting dots they had chosen not to see until someone forced them. I turned to the crowd and let myself speak. My voice was steady. It felt like stepping onto a stage built out of everything I had swallowed for months. All footage was automatically saved to the shared event folder. I thought everyone should see the full recap. Graham opened his mouth like he wanted to interrupt reality, but no sound came out. Tessa gripped his arm as if she could pull him back into the version of the world she preferred. HR looked pale. Mona from compliance was already on her feet with her phone half raised, recording or calling or documenting. Maybe all 3. I stepped back. I let the air settle around me. I let the truth do what it always does once it has been freed. The garland, the soft glow of lights, the glittering centerpieces could not soften it. Their shame filled every inch of the ballroom. I had not hacked anything. I had not bribed anyone. I had not even snooped. The folder was public because Graham approved the new auto backup rule and forgot that security feeds followed the same protocol. The system showed me everything. All I had done was press play. No one said a word for a long time. The silence felt like it had a pulse, almost like the room itself was holding its breath with me. It was strange how quickly noise dies when truth enters a room. Just a minute earlier, people were laughing, clinking glasses, calling across tables as if the night belonged to them. But after the footage played, after the numbers and signatures and unauthorized approvals filled the screen, everything fell into a stillness so complete it almost rang in my ears. Even the DJ didn't know what to do. He stood frozen beside his booth, one hand hovering over the volume controls as if turning the music back on might detonate something he didn't understand. His expression said he wished someone else would make the first move. He kept blinking at me, the screen, then back to me again, as though waiting for a cue. But there were no cues anymore. The room had crossed an invisible line, and now we were all standing in whatever truth lay on the other side. Graham finally stood up. Slowly. Too slowly for someone used to commanding attention. He smoothed his tie like he always did before speaking in meetings, a nervous habit he tried to pass off as confidence. The soft rustle of fabric sounded absurdly loud in the quiet. That tie could have been made of gold, and it still wouldn't have covered the kind of rot glowing behind him on the 12-foot screen. He looked so small in that moment. The kind of small that only happens when the image someone built for everyone else finally collapses. He looked at me. Just for a second. But it was long enough to see the shift. Not fear, not guilt, just recognition. The simple, unavoidable realization that his story was no longer his to tell. He wasn't the narrator anymore. He wasn't the hero. He wasn't even the villain in control. He was just a man staring at the consequences he thought he could outrun. Then the excuses came. This is clearly out of context. Kendra, this isn't the time or place. His voice cracked on the last word, barely noticeable unless you were listening for it. And I was. I had been listening for months. I met his gaze, calm and steady. You approved the folder, Graham. You named it Transparency Initiative. Remember that? The words slipped out smooth, almost gentle, the way truth sounds when it no longer needs anger to push it forward. He blinked. Just once. But it was enough to reveal the first crack in his mask. HR was already walking toward him, not rushing, not accusing, just moving with the quiet certainty of someone whose job had suddenly become very clear. Tessa was at his side, whispering fast into his ear. Her fingers curled tightly around his wrist, as though if she let go, he would vanish and she'd be left holding all the pieces alone. She used to glide through the office with a smile so bright you could practically see your reflection in it. Now her face was pale, stripped of every expression she had practiced, and I just stood there. I didn't cry. Not after everything. I didn't flinch. Didn't let the heat rise in my cheeks, even though I could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in that ballroom pressing into me. Some eyes were wide with shock, some narrowed with disbelief, some softened, slow and understanding, and a few carried a quiet, almost reverent smile, the kind that said she did what we were too afraid to do. No applause yet, no murmuring agreement, just the silent acknowledgement that someone had finally broken the rules that weren't written down but deeply enforced. Because this wasn't just about misconduct. It wasn't about a single folder or a single night or a single moment caught on camera. This was about everything they stole behind it. 6 months earlier, I had submitted a proposal for the annual conference, my design, my strategy, my outline, my budget. I stayed late for 3 nights polishing every detail. I even rehearsed the pitch in the mirror until the words sounded like they belonged in the world. He rejected it 2 weeks later. Too ambitious, he said. Maybe next year. I still remember sitting in that conference room, nodding like his decision didn't gut me. But 3 months after that, Tessa presented nearly the exact same plan. Down to the formatting. My formatting. She stood on the stage in her red blazer with her voice steady and clear and confident. People clapped. They weren't clapping for the work. They were clapping for her smile and her timing and the way she had learned to echo Graham's phrases perfectly. And Graham clapped the loudest. I was told to be a team player, so I stayed quiet. I swallowed the sting. I pretended it didn't matter because pretending felt easier than starting a war I didn't know how to fight. Years of being told to be polite and patient and grateful for the opportunities I got had trained me to think silence was the cost of survival. But silence isn't neutral. Silence becomes a prison, and eventually, you realize the bars were never built by you in the first place. After that, I started noticing patterns. Late-night meetings scheduled only for them, budget approvals that didn't add up, sudden praise for things I knew she hadn't touched, conversations that stopped when I walked into rooms, my name disappearing from documents where it had once lived, the kind of patterns that reveal themselves only when you stop convincing yourself they are coincidence. So when I volunteered to coordinate the Christmas party, no one thought anything of it. They handed me everything. Access to the AV system, keys to storage, control of the photo booth archive, authority over the shared event folders, permissions that most people didn't even know existed. They assumed I would smile and decorate and create a slideshow full of holiday cheer. They assumed I would play nice. They assumed wrong. I didn't go looking for that video. It found me. The system auto-backed everything from the security cameras into a folder labeled Events. One night I was reviewing files, half asleep with a mug of cocoa growing cold beside me, and there it was. A thumbnail that didn't match the others. A timestamp in the corner. At first I clicked it open without thinking, and when I realized what I was seeing, I closed it just as quickly. I told myself it wasn't my business. Told myself if I ignored it, things would go back to normal. But nothing about this place had been normal for a long time. And when I opened the budget folder again and saw the same vendor charges, the same missing approvals, the same unexplained transfers, everything inside me went still. I remembered how small they made me feel, how many times I had watched my own ideas walk into a room wearing someone else's voice. How often I had smiled, even when it hurt, because that is what women are told to do. Make it easy, make it pleasant, make it quiet. But in that moment, something inside me stopped sitting down, stopped shrinking, stopped apologizing for wanting to be seen. The system had given me the truth. All I had to do was not look away. I didn't alter a single file, didn't rename anything, didn't move the video, didn't touch the metadata. I simply added it to the queue. Let the story tell itself. And now they were unraveling. Tessa had finally let go of Graham's wrist. Her hand fell to her side slowly, almost mechanically, as if her body had forgotten how to move without someone directing it. The bright, lacquered confidence she usually wore had drained out of her, leaving her face pale and tight, her jaw locked in a way that made her look older than she had an hour ago. Her eyes darted from the screen to the floor to the crowd, searching for an exit, for a script, for anything that could tell her what to do next. But nothing came, not even Graham. He turned instead to Mona from HR, who had stepped just close enough to signal authority without making a scene. His voice dipped low, strained, but still reaching for that old tone of command he leaned on in every meeting. I think we should handle this internally. This whole thing, he gestured vaguely as if waving his hand at the truth could make it evaporate. Mona didn't blink. She didn't even shift her weight. There's a code of conduct clause in your contract. I suggest you step into the conference room now. Her voice was even, almost gentle, but underneath it lived a steel that couldn't be argued with. You could feel the shift ripple across the room. The power he once held so effortlessly was no longer his. It was slipping through his fingers with every breath he took. Two other HR staff members began to move toward him. Not aggressively, just purposefully. Their footsteps were quiet, but the intent echoed louder than anything else in the ballroom. People started whispering again, but the tone was different this time. Not mocking, not cruel, just stunned. As if they were witnessing a moment they never expected to unfold in real time. I stood still, feeling the energy shift in slow, deliberate waves. It was strange how your body can remember every moment someone made you feel small and yet still be surprised when justice finally arrives. I felt none of the triumph people might imagine, just clarity, a calm, steady sense of alignment. Like the world had paused long enough to click back into place. Graham's eyes darted around the room, searching for allies who were no longer there. People he had mentored looked away. People he had intimidated stared openly now, letting the truth settle through the layers of their own memories. He opened his mouth again, maybe to defend himself, maybe to redirect blame. But no sound came. And that's when it happened. Somewhere between the gingerbread cookies and the gift table, someone clapped. Just once. A single, sharp sound that cracked through the tension like a spark catching dry wood. Then twice. And then others joined. Not loud, not triumphant. Just steady. Quiet. Real. A soft, spreading applause that felt more like acknowledgement than celebration. A recognition that someone, finally, had stepped up when everyone else stayed silent. I didn't look to see who started it. I didn't need to. The sound reached me like a hand on my shoulder, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I could feel the applause move through the room, not as praise, but as release. People letting go of the breath they'd been holding. People realizing that truth didn't always need an invitation. Sometimes it just needed a witness. Graham inhaled sharply. Tessa stared at the floor. HR motioned toward the conference room again, firmer now, and Graham finally moved. Slowly. Each step looked heavier than the last. Tessa followed a moment later, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The sound echoed strangely, like the last remnants of something falling apart. The ballroom remained still. No one rushed toward me. No one bombarded me with questions. They just watched, observed, absorbed. And in their silence, I felt something shift inside my own chest. The years of swallowing disappointment, the months of pretending not to notice, the countless times I told myself to be patient, professional, gracious. It all loosened its grip. For the first time in a long while, I felt tall. Not physically, Not in stature, but in truth. In the space I was finally allowing myself to take up. I knew this moment didn't fix everything. I knew tomorrow would come with questions and meetings and paperwork and explanations. But that wasn't what mattered right now. What mattered was that the story they tried to write without me had been reclaimed. What mattered was that everyone in that room finally saw what had been happening in the dark corners where power likes to hide. And as the applause faded into a soft hush, I realized something else. I wasn't alone anymore. Not in the way that counts. People might not have spoken up before, but they saw it now. They understood. And somewhere deep inside me, a quiet resolve settled into place. This wasn't just exposure. This wasn't revenge. This was the first chapter of something much larger than their downfall. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders as if someone had finally opened a window in a room I didn't realize had gone stale. I stepped back from the screen. The remote felt warm in my hand now, almost familiar. Like a tool instead of a weapon, the truth had already done the work. All I had done was let it breathe. They escorted him out before dessert. The timing felt almost symbolic, like the night wanted to split itself cleanly in two. Before and after. What we thought we knew and what we could never unsee again. HR didn't drag him. They didn't have to. He walked on his own, shoulders tight, jaw locked, each step landing with the weight of someone who knew the fall had already started but was still praying, somewhere deep in the old habits of his mind, that maybe the ground would catch him halfway down. But falls, like his, don't soften. They don't pause. They just reveal. Tessa didn't follow him. She stood frozen for a few seconds, staring at the space he had just occupied as if she expected him to turn back and call her, or at least give her something to react to. Her shoulders stiffened. Her arms crossed so tightly I could see her nails pressing through the sleeves of her sweater. She wasn't angry. She wasn't pleading. She was calculating something behind her eyes, something she didn't want anyone to see. Then she turned, slowly, and walked in. The opposite direction. No goodbye. No explanation. No attempt to defend him or herself. Just two exits, two stories breaking apart in different directions, like threads snapping under their own weight. I didn't move. I stayed near the projector, letting the leftover glow from the screen wash across my hands. It felt strange, standing there in the exact same place while the entire room rearranged itself around the absence of two people. I waited until Mona from HR returned from the conference room. She approached me quietly, her steps soft, controlled. When she reached the riser, she didn't speak. She just gave me the smallest nod. A single, steady acknowledgement. And somehow, it was enough. It told me I wasn't out of line. It told me I wasn't alone. It told me the truth had landed exactly where it needed to. I stepped down from the riser and let myself breathe. A long, slow exhale. One I had been holding since July, when I first saw the shift in Graham's eyes after my proposal threatened to make me too visible. One I had been holding through every quiet dismissal, every stolen idea, every meeting where I was spoken over but expected to smile. The breath left my body like something older than air. Like fear, like doubt, like the version of myself who thought silence was safety. People didn't rush me. No one swarmed in looking for gossip or details. They didn't crowd or whisper or shove phones in my face. They gave me space. Real space. The kind people offer only when they've recognized a storm for what it truly was, and they understand now who built the shelter and who stood outside pretending it wasn't raining. They stepped back. They let me move at my own pace. I had never seen that kind of quiet respect in this office before. It settled around me like a blanket I hadn't realized I needed. It wasn't long before someone approached, though. Rachel from accounting, the woman who always shared her extra lemon bars in the break room, always labeled the coffee pots when no one else bothered, always remembered birthdays even when the rest of the office forgot. She came to my side quietly. No dramatic entrance, no searching look. Just her. Just steady. "You okay?" she asked, her voice barely above the hum of the lights. "I am now," I said, and I meant it. Completely. She didn't ask anything else. She didn't corner me with curiosity or force a conversation I wasn't ready for. She simply touched my arm, warm and gentle, a gesture small enough to disappear, but meaningful enough to stay with me. Then she walked back to her table, leaving behind only the soft scent of lemon sugar and understanding. The rest of the night settled into a quieter rhythm, not awkward, not heavy, just different. The DJ, who had been frozen earlier, finally found something he could work with. He shifted into slow jazz, the kind of music that fills a room without demanding anything from it. People didn't dance. They didn't try to revive the earlier energy. They just stayed. Because some endings need witnesses. Because leaving too soon can feel like ignoring the truth when it's still hanging in the air like mist. I eventually sat down, choosing a table off to the side near the ice sculpture that had started melting around the edges. Little streams of water trickled down its sides, catching the light in trembling silver lines. I reached out and let my fingers brush the white linen tablecloth. The fabric felt cool, almost damp, though I knew it wasn't. A glass of water someone had left behind sat nearby, condensation slipping down its surface in thin, clear trails. My fingertips hovered over it, absorbing the chill that matched the strange calm settling into my chest. I thought about everything, not just tonight, not just the fallout echoing across the ballroom. I thought about all the small things that built up to this moment, the small hurts that didn't feel small at the time, even though I convinced myself they were. I remembered the day Graham said I was too assertive in client meetings, as if confidence was something I needed to apologize for. I remembered the time Tessa called me sweetheart in front of the board, her voice dripping with condescension wrapped in fake warmth. I remembered the annual review where my work was labeled steady while hers was visionary, even though I had done the drafting and she had only rearranged my bullet points. But the memory that hurt the most wasn't any of those. It was the week I started believing them. There was a stretch of days in September when their behavior wore me thin enough that I questioned myself more than I questioned them. Maybe I was too ambitious. Maybe I did take things too personally. Maybe I wasn't enough. Maybe their version of me was the truth and mine was the delusion. That's what burns the longest, the moment you lose your own reflection in the fog of someone else's words. And now that lie wasn't living in my chest anymore. It was up there, on the screen, in the open, pixelated for everyone to see. It had context, it had a timeline, it had names, and it had finally been spoken out loud, even if the voice delivering it didn't need to raise itself above a whisper. There is something terrifying about exposure, not just for them. For me, too, because pressing play meant there was no going back to pretending I didn't know. It meant revealing how much I had noticed, how long I had stayed quiet, how closely I had watched the pattern repeat and repeat until the truth felt too large to ignore. It meant admitting I had reached my limit, that I had allowed the fire to come closer than I should have before finally standing up and saying enough. But in that stillness, between the fading candlelight and the peppermint scent drifting from the dessert table, something inside me softened, not like surrender, more like release. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt free, not triumphant, not smug, just free. Like a door I didn't realize had been locked was finally open, and the air on the other side didn't smell like fear anymore. I sat with that feeling, letting it move through me slowly, almost cautiously, like it wasn't sure it had permission to stay. Freedom is quiet in the beginning. It doesn't rush in or wave its arms. It settles like warm air after a storm, filling the cracks left behind. I let my palms rest flat on the table, grounding myself in the moment, in the hum of the lights overhead, in the faint clink of glassware as people shifted at their tables, unsure whether to speak or simply exist in the aftermath. Across the room, someone laughed softly, not the careless kind that had filled the ballroom earlier, but the fragile kind that comes after tension breaks, when people are still testing the sound of their own voices. A couple of co-workers leaned close to each other, whispering with expressions that weren't cruel, just human, processing, reframing, rewriting the stories they had believed about our workplace and the people who had shaped it. I didn't mind the whispers. They no longer felt like threats. They weren't daggers aimed at my confidence or judgments disguised as opinions. They were people coming to terms with a truth they hadn't been ready to see until someone projected it 10 feet tall in a room full of witnesses. I didn't feel targeted. I didn't feel small. I felt present, as if my feet were finally planted in the version of reality that belonged to me instead of the one I had been rehearsing for years. The ice sculpture continued melting beside me, water gathering in a thin pool around the base. A small drip echoed in a rhythm against the tray beneath it, steady and soft. It reminded me of all the details we overlook when we're busy trying to survive places that shrink us. The sculpture had been carved for beauty, for spectacle, for decoration. But now, in the aftermath of everything, I saw it differently. It wasn't melting because it failed. It was melting because its purpose for the evening had been fulfilled. It had served its time. It was allowed to change shape, allowed to disappear. I let the symbolism sit with me longer than I expected. People continued to stay. They lingered near the tables, holding half-empty glasses, plates they no longer touched, napkins folded and unfolded in restless hands. No one seemed eager to walk out the doors. Not because they were waiting for more drama or another revelation, but because endings like this needed stillness, needed space to settle. You can't rush a shift in truth. You have to let it land where it lands. A soft rustling of fabric pulled my attention toward the corridor leading to the conference rooms. Mona stepped out, her expression composed but no longer impassive. She had done her job and done it well. But even she carried the weight of what had been set in motion tonight. She met my eyes across the room and gave another small nod, not approval, not congratulations, just recognition. A shared understanding that the truth, once aired, doesn't go back into storage. Someone nearby cleared their throat, and a few chairs scraped quietly against the floor as people regrouped. A handful of coworkers glanced at me, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with a kind of cautious admiration. Not loud, not ostentatious, just steady, as if acknowledging that something brave had happened, even if they didn't have the words for it. I took another slow sip of water, letting the coolness slide down my throat, anchoring me further into the moment. My reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. Not distorted, not dimmed, just me. Clearer somehow, as if the room's light, softened by the lingering glow of the chandeliers, had finally caught me at the right angle. The peppermint scent from the dessert table drifted closer with each passing minute. The candles flickered, their small flames bending gently whenever someone walked by. I watched the shadows move across the white tablecloths, soft and wavering, like memories shifting into new shapes. The conversations around the room grew a little louder, a little braver, the initial shock giving way to processing, to release, to relief. It struck me then how many people must have carried their own quiet hurts in this place, their own stolen ideas, their own clipped wings, their own weeks of believing they were the problem. Maybe that was why no one had left yet. Maybe they needed this moment as much as I did. And as I sat there, hands steady, breathing even, I felt something inside me open, a space I had kept sealed shut for too long, a place where self-doubt had lived rent-free, where fear had curled tight and stubborn, where silence had masqueraded as professionalism. That space was empty now, not hollow, ready. Because tonight wasn't just the end of something twisted, it was the beginning of something honest. Not power, not revenge, just selfhood. The quiet kind that builds a foundation without anyone noticing until one day they do. I let my gaze drift toward the empty riser where I had stood, remote in hand, while the truth played out in harsh, undeniable clarity. The faint outline of my footprints remained on the mat, testament to the moment I stepped into a version of myself I hadn't met before. Free. Not victorious, not smug. Just free. The kind of freedom that doesn't shout or demand applause. It breathes. It settles. It makes you taller without changing your height. It whispers, "Finally, you were never the problem." And I believed it. For once, I believed it fully. By Monday morning, the emails started. Not loud ones. Not the kind with exclamation points or forwarded chains or bolded subject lines asking, "Can you believe what happened?" No gossip disguised as concern. No thinly veiled judgment pretending to be curiosity. These were different. Quiet notes, private messages from people who had barely spoken to me outside of polite hallway greetings or procedural meetings where we were all just checking boxes and trying to get through the day. They came one by one at first, a soft ping, then another, and another, little digital whispers threading through the gray of an early workday. "Thank you for what you did. I saw it too, but I didn't know how to say it. I wish I had your courage." Some came from interns whose names I had only learned last month. Others from people who had been here longer than me, people with corner office ambitions and carefully maintained reputations who usually stayed far away from anything that smelled like conflict. One came from Karen in legal. She was the type who always wore navy and spoke with a calm that made everyone else lower their voices out of instinct. Her message was just one line. "You reminded us what accountability looks like. No signature, no emojis, no explanation. But somehow it felt heavier than all the others combined. And yet, even with those messages, I didn't feel brave. Not really. I didn't feel like the heroine people were turning me into in their minds. I felt like someone who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. Someone who had stopped shrinking, stopped smoothing her edges, stopped translating her worth into something quieter so it wouldn't offend anyone. HR called me in for a formal debrief that same week. I woke that morning with a strange stillness inside me. Not nerves, not dread. A quiet steadiness that felt borrowed from a version of myself I was just beginning to meet. I wore gray slacks and a white blouse. No jewelry. No makeup. Just clean lines and calm answers. I didn't want distraction. I didn't need armor. I just needed clarity. The HR conference room always smelled faintly of paper and peppermint tea. Mona and two other staff members sat across from me, their laptops open, their expressions professional but not cold. They asked if I'd altered anything. I said no. They asked if I intended to humiliate Graham and Tessa. I told them I didn't intend anything. I simply presented the truth in the same order the system recorded it. That sentence hung in the air for a moment. Not defensive, not combative, just factual. Then Mona leaned in, lowering her voice a little, not in secrecy, but in sincerity. "Did you know the camera angle was going to catch them like that?" There was something underneath her question, something halfway between suspicion and genuine curiosity, as if she needed to understand not just my actions, but my heart behind them. "No," I said, "but the truth always finds the camera, doesn't it?" The room breathed with me. She didn't smile, but she didn't argue, and that silence between us felt like its own kind of agreement. After that meeting, things shifted, not dramatically. Not like a spotlight suddenly swung my way. More like the office exhaled and rearranged itself around a new center of gravity. I started being invited to planning meetings I used to hear about only after the coffee had gone cold and the minutes were already typed up. My name showed up higher in CC lines, not buried under layers of hierarchy. People stopped interrupting me mid-sentence. They paused. They listened. They considered. It wasn't deference. It was respect. A foreign language I was finally becoming fluent in. But more than the attention, more than the invitations or the shifts in tone, I noticed the absence of second-guessing myself, the absence of rehearsing every sentence in my mind before speaking it aloud, the absence of that gnawing fear that I was too much or not enough or somehow occupying space I hadn't earned. It was like walking back into a room I had always lived in, only to realize that an electrical buzz I'd learned to ignore, the soft, persistent hum of a fluorescent light, had finally gone silent. Peace doesn't shout. It doesn't perform. It just arrives. And when it does, you notice the air first, how it feels lighter, cleaner, easier to breathe. I didn't realize how long I had carried myself in a defensive crouch until I finally stood without it. Tessa resigned quietly. No speech, no farewell lunch, no carefully crafted email thanking the company for the opportunity. Just a memo from HR 1 week later, and her office cleared out by noon. I walked past it once. The light was off, the desk empty, the corkboard bare except for a single pushpin she must have forgotten to remove. It all looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe she had simply been using the space to inflate her own presence. Graham, on the other hand, clung to the sinking ship. He was suspended pending an internal investigation. Rumor had it he was meeting with lawyers, firing off letters, trying to negotiate terms behind closed doors. But in a place like ours, perception is louder than paperwork, and he had already lost that battle the second his face lit up the projector screen. People don't forget what they saw with their own eyes. Truth, once witnessed, doesn't go back into memory's basement. I could have pressed further, filed complaints, pushed for external review, carried the fight into arenas with bigger audiences. But I didn't need to, because watching them fall wasn't the win. Not for me. What mattered wasn't the collapse of their reputations. It was the rise I started seeing in everyone else. Even the interns spoke louder in meetings. Shoulders straighter, voices steadier. People who had once nodded along without question started asking why. Why this policy? Why this process? Why these decisions? It was subtle, but powerful, as if the entire floor remembered at the same time that we were allowed to think, allowed to question, allowed to exist without fear of being labeled difficult or ungrateful. The silence had broken, and I hadn't shattered it with a scream, just a button, just play. The shift didn't happen overnight, but you could feel it humming under the surface of everything. Hallway conversations changed. People lingered a little longer near the coffee machine, not to gossip, but to breathe in the possibility that things could be different now. There was a softness in the air, a kind of collective uncoiling. Even the morning greetings felt warmer, as if everyone had stepped out from under a shadow they didn't realize had been stretching across the entire floor. I carried myself differently too, though not in the way people might imagine. I didn't strut or glow or walk with some victorious swagger. It was quieter than that, more grounded. My steps felt steadier. My voice, even when soft, didn't tremble around the edges. I didn't brace myself before opening emails or walking into meetings. I didn't prepare for battle every time someone called my name from across the room. I just moved. I just existed. That alone felt revolutionary. There was a morning, a few days after the debrief, when I walked into the office early. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the building was washed in that cool, bluish light that makes everything appear gentler than it is. I set my bag down at my desk, logged in, and watched as the screen glowed to life. For a moment, I just sat there, fingers hovering over the keyboard, realizing how different the world felt, even though nothing around me had changed physically. It was me. I had changed. Or maybe I'd just uncovered the part of myself that had been waiting under all the noise. Later that day, I caught sight of one of the interns, Lily, standing in front of a whiteboard during a planning session. She was explaining a new workflow she'd drafted, her voice trembling but determined. 2 months ago, she would have handed her notes to someone else and let them speak for her. But now she stood at the front, shoulders tight but lifted, eyes flicking from person to person as she braced herself to be seen. When she finished, the room didn't erupt into applause or shower her with praise. They simply nodded, engaged, asked real questions, treated her like someone whose ideas mattered, and I watched her exhale in relief. It was small, but it was everything. Moments like that became more common, people reaching out not for permission, but for collaboration, team members pushing back on unrealistic deadlines, analysts asking to review budgets before sign-off, designers refusing to let their work be diluted into someone else's credit. The whole office seemed to shift on its axis, just slightly, but enough to realign the way we carried our work and ourselves. None of this erased the hurt of what happened. It didn't undo the months or years of being talked over, overlooked, or undervalued. Healing isn't retroactive. It builds forward, layering itself in tiny increments until one day you realize the ache has softened. But seeing people stand a little taller, speak a little louder, claim a little more space, that mattered. That was its own kind of balm. One afternoon, I ran into Karen from legal in the hallway. She gave me a nod, the same quiet, steady kind she'd sent in that email. No dramatic praise, no heavy conversations, just acknowledgement. It was a grounding sort of kindness, the kind that doesn't demand anything in return. And then there was Mona. She passed me in the lobby one evening after a long day of back-to-back meetings. She didn't stop me or pull me aside. She didn't bring up the case or the investigation. She just said in that calm, level tone of hers, "Keep going." Like she knew the momentum wasn't about punishment. It was about recalibration. Even the way people addressed me changed. Not into something formal or rigid, just with a soft edge of respect that hadn't existed before. A pause to let me finish a thought. A space made at the table without hesitation. A question directed to me instead of around me. That was the win. Not their downfall. The rise of something better in its place. I could have used this shift to push harder, to demand recognition, chase publicity, carve out a bigger title for myself. But that wasn't the point. Because watching them fall wasn't justice. Justice was watching everyone else rise. Watching the office remember that we weren't meant to shrink around power, but stand beside it, challenge it, shape it. Sometimes, when I think back to the moment I pressed play, I wonder how something so simple, a button, a breath, could unravel an entire culture of silence. But the truth is, silence only feels unbreakable until someone breaks it. After that, the whole room learns a new frequency. Even now, weeks later, I can still feel the echo of that moment, not as chaos, not as fear, but as clarity, the kind that arrives not with thunder, but with a single, steady truth. Transparency doesn't destroy anything worth keeping, and all I did was show what had already been there. All I did was let the truth speak in its own voice. All I did was press play. I didn't stay late that Friday. I shut my laptop at 5, slid on my coat, and walked out of that glass building like it didn't own a single piece of me anymore. For years, I had treated the building like it had a claim on me, like the long hallways and glass walls and polished floors required some version of myself I had to earn every single day. But that evening, as the automatic doors opened and the cold brushed against my face, I felt something loosen, something lift, something return. Outside, the sky was bruised pink and gold. Tennessee sunsets always know how to perform, even on the days when the world feels like it's unraveling. The colors stretched wide, almost theatrical against the winter branches, like the sky wanted to reassure anyone looking up that endings can be beautiful too. I stood there for a moment, just breathing it in. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from a distant backyard fire, the kind families start when they want. To slow the weekend down before it even begins. The cold bit at my cheeks, but I didn't rush to my car. I let the cold happen. I let the moment hold me still. I let myself feel everything. The win, the ache, the years of silence I had carried without realizing how heavy they'd become. The strange grief that comes when you finally see how much of yourself you had folded away just to keep the peace. And beneath all of that, a slow, quiet pride. Not the loud kind that demands attention, but the steady kind that rises when you finally stop asking permission to exist. I didn't scream to be heard. I didn't sabotage anyone. I didn't manipulate or plot or build some elaborate chain of moves. I simply recognized the moment when the mic was placed in my hands and I spoke clearly. The truth is, I didn't plan any of this. I didn't wake up months ago and map out some dramatic strategy with color-coded folders and vengeful ambition. I didn't stalk their missteps or hunt for proof. I didn't even know the final piece existed until the system handed it to me. A shared folder, a camera's auto backup, and a boss too arrogant or too careless to read what he signed off on. That was it. Not sabotage, not revenge. Just information, just truth. It all came together like puzzle pieces spilled onto a table, and all I did was assemble what was already there. They assumed I'd never notice, assumed I'd keep nodding, keep shrinking, keep smoothing out my edges so everyone else could stay comfortable. They assumed my silence meant agreement, safety, predictability. She smiled at me like I was the joke. For months, that smile felt sharp enough to draw blood. But standing outside under that winter sky, I realized something important. I hadn't ruined her. I hadn't exposed anything that wasn't already true. I simply stopped protecting her image at the cost of my own. That distinction mattered more than I understood at the time, because there's a difference between harm and honesty. One destroys, the other reveals. People like them don't think they'll ever be held accountable, not because they're smarter or more capable, but because they've learned to believe the world exists to cushion their missteps, to frame their actions in the best possible light, to protect their charm or their confidence or their carefully curated reputations. They think the story bends for them because it always has. But images don't last. Footage does, emails do, receipts do, timelines do, patterns do, truth does. Some betrayals don't leave bruises, they leave silence, overlooked ideas, dismissed concerns, rewritten narratives, years of being told you're too ambitious or too sensitive or too loud or too quiet. Those betrayals accumulate quietly, unnoticed until something finally snaps the thread holding everything together. And sometimes all it takes is one well-timed slideshow. I wasn't the loudest person in that room. Never have been. I don't command attention when I walk in. I don't speak in booming tones. I don't demand to be heard. But when the moment arrived, when the truth sat waiting inside a folder I didn't create and a system I didn't control, I didn't hide from it. I didn't let fear decide for me. I let the truth speak for me, and it was louder than any lie they ever told. So, yeah, they laughed when I walked out that night. Maybe they thought I was just the party planner, just another forgettable girl with a remote and a clipboard, just someone decorating tables and picking out table runners and adjusting microphones. But I wasn't walking out empty-handed. I was walking out with clarity, with peace, with every piece of myself I had quietly traded away just to keep the office running smoothly. I was walking out with the confidence that comes not from victory, but from alignment, finally standing in a truth big enough to hold me. The last thing I said before the lights dimmed, before the whispers started, before anyone could twist the moment into something more comfortable, more polished, more palatable. I tapped the mic once and said, "Next time, think before you sink." Not as a taunt, not as revenge, but as a reminder, a nudge toward accountability, a truth wrapped in a line simple enough to remember. Because accountability isn't cruelty, it's clarity. If you were in my shoes, what would you have done? I stood there for a heartbeat after speaking, letting the words settle into the room the way dust settles after something heavy hits the ground. No sharpness, no triumph, just truth, placed gently but firmly where it belonged. Then I stepped back from the mic, letting the moment close itself. No more explaining, no more shrinking, no more cushioning other people's choices with my silence. When I think back on that night now, it doesn't feel like a victory lap. It feels like a release, a letting go of the weight I had carried so long I forgot what it felt like to stand without it. I didn't want their downfall. I didn't crave their humiliation. I simply needed the truth to stop living in my chest like a stone I kept swallowing. I needed the story to belong to itself instead of being buried in drafts, in whispers, in late-night doubts. Walking out of that building, I didn't feel powerful. I felt clear. For the first time in years, my steps felt like my own. Life didn't suddenly turn into a movie montage after that. There were still long days, still complicated meetings, still paperwork and responsibilities, and the everyday hum of work life. But something essential had shifted. The ground beneath me felt steadier, as if the world and I had struck a truce. That next week, when I sat at my desk with my morning coffee, I realized I wasn't bracing myself before opening my inbox. My shoulders weren't tight, my jaw wasn't clenched. The sunlight drifting through the slats of the blinds didn't feel like an intrusion, but an invitation. Even the familiar tapping of keyboards and low murmurs of conversation around me felt different, like the office was breathing again after holding tension for too long. People began approaching me in small ways. A nod in the hallway. A quiet thank you by the elevator. A post-it left on my desk with a simple, "You did the right thing." No fanfare, no pedestal. Just connection. Just recognition. And surprisingly, I didn't feel awkward receiving it. I didn't deflect or minimize or dismiss their gratitude. I let myself accept it not as praise, but as acknowledgement. A shared understanding that truth, once spoken, creates ripples. I also noticed something else, something softer and more subtle. I started trusting my voice again, not inflating it, not performing confidence, just trusting it. In meetings, when I had an idea, I said it without rehearsing every word in my head first. When someone interrupted me, I kept speaking until I finished my sentence. When a project needed direction, I offered guidance without worrying whether I was stepping on someone's toes. It wasn't forceful. It wasn't loud. It was steady. I didn't realize how much of myself I had been editing until I stopped. One afternoon, I found myself sitting outside during lunch, the winter sun low and pale behind a thin sheet of clouds. I wrapped my hands around a warm cup of chai and let the steam erase the last of the morning's chill. For the first time in a long time, I didn't spend the entire break replaying conversations in my head or pre-planning ones that hadn't happened yet. My mind felt quiet, spacious, like a room that had finally been cleared of boxes stacked too high. I thought about everything that had led to this point, every sidelined idea, every dismissive comment, every meeting where I felt myself folding inward, every moment I convinced myself that shrinking was the safest choice. And then I thought about that night, about the screen, about the truth filling the room with a light no one could dim, no matter how hard they tried. I didn't destroy them. I didn't expose them for revenge. I simply returned the story to its rightful owner, the truth. And the truth did what it always does. It illuminated, it clarified, it shifted the balance of things that had been leaning too far in the wrong direction for too long. In the days that followed, I realized something else. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of being overlooked, not of being underestimated, not of rocking the boat. I understood now that silence is not the price of stability. Authenticity is. And authenticity doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just stands still and refuses to move out of its own way. Sometimes it simply presses play. Weeks later, I found myself leaving the office again at 5 on the dot. No guilt, no lingering, just a clean end to a full week. The sky was fading into lavender, the air crisp with the scent of winter settling in. I walked to my car, the gravel, crunching softly under my boots, and I felt a quiet steadiness inside me, a knowing, a groundedness. I paused before unlocking my door and looked back at the building. There was no resentment, no bitterness, just perspective. This place had taken a lot from me, yes, but it had also shown me who I was when I finally stopped letting other people write my story. It had taught me that truth is not a weapon, it's a compass. And for the first time, it was pointing somewhere that felt like home. So if I had to choose whether I'd do it all again, press play, let the truth stand on its own legs, let the room feel what it needed to feel, I would. Not because it made me powerful, but because it made me whole. If this story struck a chord, hit like, subscribe, and tell me what you think in the comments.